Hey, so last one, we're going to finish strong. This is intercultural communication. So if you remember way back here, where'd it go? In the jellyfish generator thing, all this occurred within a culture, right? So all of the things, the big five that I told you about, are cultural phenomena. But what happens when you have to communicate across cultures? And so in this little mini lesson thing, we break down some of the more common things that you'll run into when you're communicating across cultures, okay? And what my hope is to finish up with these three real quick, because the last video kind of ran long. And then I'm going to talk to you about how this is going to fit into whenever you're doing the audience analysis on your presentation. Okay, this is some higher order stuff. So sometimes, if you're like, oh, this doesn't make sense, it's because you got to process. That's the thing you got to do. All right, so first phenomena to think about is the idea of individualistic cultures versus collectivistic cultures. Perhaps you've heard about this before in like a psychology class or a sociology class. But basically what it is that in an individualistic culture, for example, the focus is on the individual and their responsibility is to themselves, right? So we value an orientation that respects the autonomy and independence of individuals. So for example, in this society, we raise our kids to go out and be on their own, to start their own families and live lives that are separate from ours as parents, right? And we also tend to be more competitive. So if that's what you're used to, if you're like, oh, I'm used to the focus being on me and me doing my own thing, that would be you would be correct, because the U.S. is a very individualistic culture, probably the highest individualistic culture in the world today. Collectivistic cultures, just as a stereotype, or I mean not a stereotype because it's a real thing, but Asian cultures tend to be more collectivistic. So this is an orientation that stresses the needs of the group, right? And so your primary responsibility, if you're in this culture, or is to support your family, okay? And so how well your family does, or the group that you're in does, if you're in a company, for example, does reflects back on you, and that's like a weird thing that is probably a foreign concept. So, for example, a fascinating Adam fact, here I am revealing things, is that like I would say, God, at least I would say a solid 70% of my cousins are in jail for various reasons. If I lived in a collectivistic culture, people would look at me and say, you are not helping your family succeed. And therefore, the fact that they're in jail reflects poorly on you. And thankfully, because we live in the U.S. in an individualistic culture, we say, hey, whatever, your cousins are in jail. That has nothing to do with you at all, because you're a different person, okay? So other things about collectivistic cultures, they tend to defer to elders more when making decisions, and then they often tend to be more collaborative. Another fun, fascinating fact is that even in the United States, which is a highly individualistic culture, if you are from a lower, like if you're working class, if you're poor, if you're from a low socioeconomic standing, because the struggle is real and you have to work together to get by, you tend to be more collectivistic. Poor people tend to have a higher social capital as well, which is kind of interesting. Like in communities, like there tends to be greater bonding than there is the higher up you get on the socioeconomic food chain. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. So the way that this applies to your speeches, though, is so if you're in an individualistic culture like the U.S. and you think, oh, I'm going to do an activity, it makes perfect sense and would probably be received really well if you said, we're going to have a fun game and there's going to be a winner, okay? But if you're presenting out of the country, if you're presenting, or to like a group of, say, people from Mexico, because it tends to be more collectivistic, you may find that they may want a game where they can collaborate, or an activity where they can work together, because they get like joy and satisfaction out of working together to do the thing and accomplishing it together, as opposed to I won. Okay, all right. Next thing. Oops, sorry, I skipped one. So the next thing is this concept of power distance. And this is kind of a weird foreign concept for you if you've never run into it before, but different cultures believe that there should be different distances between superior and subordinate in society and in organizations, right? So imagine that you go to work and you have a supervisor in the US. That person probably doesn't lord that over you, right? Like that's what you would say. You probably call them by their first name. They have a different job than you, and it's probably more important, and they get paid more at this point in your life. But in general, they don't. We would say that they like wear that lightly, right? So those people that are in power tend to emphasize equality, informality, and they probably encourage you to speak your mind, right? Now, if you're from a high power distance country, the distance being the distance between the superior and subordinate in status, those countries, which again tend to be more Asian countries, have they see that as being good, right? Like that there's that hierarchy and that people know what their place is. And in that, culture, you would not speak up against your, superior. You would be much more deferent and whatnot. Now that sounds really silly, and you think like, all right, like how does this matter in the real world? But like interesting story, Korean Airlines back in the 80s was like the most crashable airline. I mean, they crashed more than all the other airlines in the world put together. And so, they did a big study, of course, because they wanted to know why their planes kept going down. And they found that their pilots were, adequately trained, or at least as trained as well as, all the other pilots in the world, and that their planes were just as well kept up. I mean, hell, everybody buys their planes from like either Airbus or Boeing, so they're all made by the same people. And what they eventually found was that the thing that was causing their planes to crash was this high power distance at work between their pilot and co-pilot. And so when you think about flying a plane, like the pilot's job is to fly the plane, and the co-pilot's job is to, do all the thinking that the pilot can't do because he's flying the plane, right? And so when the co-pilot arrives at a conclusion that is, contrary to what the pilot's doing, he's supposed to then speak up and say, hey, you're doing that, not right, and you should do it this way. But if you're from a high power distance country, then that becomes really hard to do, because in that situation, the pilot is, more superior and the co-pilot is more subordinate. And so in a way, it's worse than having no co-pilot at all, because the pilot's thinking, I'm going to be told if I'm doing something wrong or if there's something that I'm not aware of. And they're lulled into a false sense of confidence because the co-pilot ain't going to do that, right? And so that's why Korean Air crashed. And so they actually, fun follow-up to the story there. They actually would send their pilots and co-pilots to school where they'd force the co-pilot to speak out against the pilot. And it was real hard, and people cried. And that's such a foreign concept for us here in the U.S. All right, so those are a couple of the big ones. There's some more in your book that you'll read. But I want to show you real quick where this comes into play. And so that is whenever you're doing your audience analysis. Again, the purpose of the course, and at least this lesson, is to get you outside of your own head and thinking about what is my audience, what's their field of experience, what's their culture, what is their background, et cetera, and how is it going to affect the way that I'm trying to get my message to them, okay? And so when we ask you in your train and demo things here, and all the other ones as well, to do this audience analysis, we're asking for numbers in here for age and size and stuff, but we also want a narrative. So how is this going to impact, right? So, and we've got some general ones in here. So background could be regionality, right? So where are they from? In general, most of the people that you're going to talk to are from Missouri, but how does that affect, your talk, right? It could also be, race and ethnicity. It could be gender as well. So there are things that you could fit into there and say all right, well, because of this, these are some things that I need to think about or at least be aware of. Knowledge, interests, and experience. This tends to fall under that education and occupation, right? So education might be all of you all that you're speaking to are college educated, and because of that, there's words that you can use that you couldn't use if you were speaking to LA audience, right? But some things that you need to think about. So say you're doing your train and demo on corn or whatever, and you're using really a specific jargon, but most of the people in your class aren't plant science majors or know anything about real crop production, then you need to tone down your jargon, right, and use more common things, or just take the time during your talk to go over some of that technical language so that they can understand what you're saying. Okay. All of you all are about the same age, right? There's not going to be a wild difference between 18 and 22, but just know that, going forward, that's a thing that you need to consider whenever you're talking, because not just because of the vocabulary that you choose, but because of the experience that people have had. And you remember andragogy versus pedagogy, right? So remember, think of me trying to sell a 60-year-old on Facebook in 2008 and him being afraid that his house was going to get robbed if he used his real name and picture. Size is a thing that we're going to talk about in week 10. And so that's just, you can let that go for the moment. But just know that giving a talk to 20 people is wildly different than giving a talk to 400 people, because it's really hard to do get acquainted games with 400 people. So that's kind of where it all fits together. Like this lesson, like when you think about like who are you talking to, this is where you would write that out. Okay. Hopefully this has been good. Do the readings, do the comprehension check, and know that in weeks 5, 6, and 7, you guys are going to do a cultural simulation game with me and the TAs, in which we divide you into 2 different cultures along some fun lines, and then see what shakes out. It's going to be super awkward. All right, great. Talk to you later.